Josh Blank, Research Director at the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. So here we are, less than 100 days out before the November election. And if you look at the marquee race, the governor's race, it looks like Governor Abbott right now stands to have a 5 to 8% percentage point lead over Beto O'Rourke. What's your assessment of that? Do you think that is an accurate reflection of what's going to happen?
Well, I think it's certainly an accurate reflection of where we are now. I think, in terms of how predictive it is of what is going to happen, I think there's just so many issues in the air at the moment. And in some ways, that's why this race is partially as close as it is. It's hard to say, how the state is going to proceed and how the campaigns are going to proceed on issues of abortion, gun violence, the grid, the economy, immigration and border security, to name a few of the major issues that are really animating this race. And I think that because of that, what we're looking at is a state that's about, +5 to +6 points Republican. But, with depending on the way that the issues play out and how that motivates different set of voters, that race could tighten or it could widen.
I was just going to ask you, what do you think would change it in either direction? Because, when you look historically at Governor Abbott's races, he had a huge lead over Wendy Davis. Obviously, that was like a 20-point difference.
Mm-hmm.
And then last time around in 2018, which was a good year for Democrats, his lead was still double digits.
Mm-hmm.
And so here we are in a much tighter race in a year that many considered favorable to Republicans, and it's in the single digits.
Yeah, I think something that we're trying to figure out at this point is does that single digit race reflect the natural progression of a more Democratic, of a less Republican state, let's say, over the last 10 years? Or does that margin that we're seeing in polling right now reflect the issue environment, right? Reflect an environment that I think was perceived to be favorable to Republicans going into this election cycle, but because of the nature of the way that issues have presented themselves here in Texas, whether it be the grid or abortion or gun violence, that maybe that's already built into this, or that's something that's going to manifest on election day. And that's sort of something I think it's hard to know at this point what we're looking at, whether this is really a 4 to 8 point race or a 2 to 3 point race right now.
And last week with the news about GDP slipping for the second consecutive quarter, obviously there was a lot of debate over, is this a recession? Is this not a recession? But I was out talking with people and just at random about where they were on this. And there was a lot of anger about the food prices in particular, mm-hmm. and some desperation as well. They don't know how they were going to afford it all. How do you think that's going to translate? Historically, the economy has been the motivating factor on elections. Do you see that this time as well?
I think you can't discount the power that the economy has when it comes to elections. Ultimately, it's something that touches everybody's lives, and it does it on a near daily or near daily basis. In our most recent polling back in June, nearly 60% of Texans said that increases in the price of food have had a major impact on their household finances. We know that 76% of Texas voters say that the state is on the wrong track right now, which is the highest share that have ever said this in over 50 public statewide polls that we've done over the last decade plus. The thing is that I think Greg Abbott is betting on the fact that in a midterm year with Democrats in control of the federal government, that he can point to Joe Biden and say this is his fault, and that certainly is a very common and tried and true campaign approach to managing a situation like this. The difficulty, I think, for Abbott becomes if voters start to ask what Texas government has been doing over the last 5, 6, 8 years that put people in a situation where housing is more expensive, transportation isn't getting better. And if they're looking at their, the bottom line in their bank accounts, at some point, the question becomes, is this an anti-democratic election or is this an anti-incumbent election?
And, we did polling as well. CBS News and YouGov did polling for our TV station, CBS DFW. And one thing that they found was the national economy was worse than the Texas economy. And they view the Texas economy much more in a positive light than the national economy. I mean, we've seen companies move here, people voting with their feet.
Mhm.
And do you think that people will be able to differentiate that at the ballot box?
I think this is all relative. Ultimately, Texans are always bullish on Texas's economy relative to the nation's as a whole. I think it's part of being a Texan in some ways. But if you've been looking at the polling data over the last decade, what you find is that Texans have been much more bullish on Texas's economy relative to the national economy in the past and in the wake of past crises, most specifically in the wake of the housing crisis. Ultimately, Texans had a very negative view of the national economy while looking to Texas and having very, I would say, rose-colored glasses. We don't see that anymore. So even though, yes, Texans rate the Texas economy better than the national economy, still ultimately we're seeing some of the most negative evaluations of Texas's economy that we've seen in a decade plus.
And let me ask you about, what do you think a path for victory for Beto O'Rourke? Is there a possible path for victory for him? And if so, what would that be?
I think for Beto O'Rourke, the path to victory is relatively simple, if hard to execute, which is ultimately to make this election a referendum and not a choice. Greg Abbott has a lot of advantages at his disposal, including the issue environment. And the reality is that immigration and border security play a special role in Texas, and it's an issue that Democrats have pretty low credibility on with voters, and that Abbott can continue to return to. He can point to the negative, economy and say, do you really want to trust a Democrat here? But for O'Rourke, I think he has the possibility of saying, look, this isn't about a choice. This is about a referendum. And ultimately, I think if you ask people about the direction of the state, about the response of state government to some of these major issues, and about, I think what the state is going to do next on some of these major issues where, really government is out of step with public opinion on things like abortion and guns. Ultimately, if O'Rourke can deliver that case to enough voters, especially independent voters, I think this race could tighten. But it's going to be a really heavy lift in a state that really favors Republicans by, anywhere from 3 to 10 points.
And a lot of people are pointing to what happened in Kansas, where the voters there decided against having a ban on abortion. And so a lot of people are pointing to that. What impact, if any, do you think that would have on Texas in the November election?
I think it's important to distinguish a vote explicitly on abortion access versus a vote on candidates to run government. And ultimately, the abortion issue is one among many that voters will be voting on come November. I think ultimately, if you had a vote in Texas similar to the one you had in Kansas on abortion access, you would probably get a pretty similar outcome with majorities of voters voting for some access to abortion in this state. Ultimately, that's a very different proposition than whether you want Beto O'Rourke or Greg Abbott to be governor.
And so going back to your point before about what a path for victory could look like for O'Rourke, you're saying he has to seize on this referendum when it comes to abortion and guns. And you think that's going to be his only way to try to keep that issue alive, so to speak, all the way through November, and make this as this is an important choice that people face, and it's either do or die on this issue.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think O'Rourke does have some credibility to point out. It's not the most inspiring message, but the state is gerrymandered to the point that we know that there will be a majority of Republicans in the state House, there'll be a majority of Republicans controlling the state Senate, and there will be a majority of Republicans in the congressional delegation. I think for O'Rourke, to some extent, there's the possibility of doing nothing, ultimately not moving the state further to the right on abortion, not expanding gun access further. And even that might be attractive to some voters a significant share of voters who are honestly sick of politics as usual. And it wouldn't be the first time that voters sent a governor to, a candidate to become governor, basically to stop, the trajectory of what's going on. it's a little more sophisticated than I would expect in our polarized time, and given the power the negative partisanship has, the distaste that partisans on one side had for people from the other side of the political aisle. But I do think that the conditions are ripe for something different to happen when there's so much dissatisfaction right now.
And let me ask you, as far as, typically we hear candidates have to move to the middle, in a general election. But Governor Abbott's campaign has said, no, we have to still, appeal to our voters, and they know who their voters are, conservatives, et cetera. And doesn't that make sense when you go back and you look at 2018 in that very tight race when O'Rourke ran against Senator Cruz? Cruz was able to win because his voters at the end of the day showed up. And so if you're not appealing to your voters, going to the middle won't work. Is that correct?
Um, hmm. I think this idea of going to the middle can manifest in different ways. I mean, first and foremost, the question is, do you think the election is more about mobilization, or is it more about persuasion? And ultimately, I think Republicans have been able to win elections in Texas because there are more Republican voters than Democrats, and among those who are unaffiliated, they tend to lean in a more conservative direction. And so ultimately, if you can win elections by turning out your voters and your voters alone, it's a lot easier. The reality is that the state becomes more competitive, that method becomes more and more challenging. And so I think, ultimately what moving to the middle means doesn't necessarily mean moderating your position. It can also just mean a change in focus. And so for Governor Abbott, for instance, who ran in a very, I would say in a relatively competitive primary to become governor, he definitely endorsed and advanced some very, very far right positions in the state that I think many believed was to appeal to those Republican primary voters. Ultimately, moderating or moving to the middle in the general for Abbott doesn't mean abandoning those positions. It means changing the focus to an issue that plays well for him amongst the broadest swath of voters that he can, which is immigration and border security. That's moderating in Texas. Ultimately, I think you can see that because what you're not hearing a lot from the Abbott campaign is what the state is going to do about enforcing its new abortion laws in the next legislative session. We're not hearing anything about any sort of advances on gun safety measures in the legislative session coming up. We're not really hearing much about further reforms to the grid. And so ultimately, these issues are issues that, don't play as well for the governor. And so ultimately, moderating doesn't mean walking away from positions he's taken. It just simply means changing the focus to something that is more advantageous, for his campaign.
And let me ask you about the lieutenant governor's race. This is obviously a rematch from 2018 between Dan Patrick and Mike Collier. Where do you see this race?
This is an interesting race. I mean, Patrick has been an unapologetic conservative his entire time leading the Texas Senate. But in so doing, he's increased the negative evaluations that Democrats hold of him, and a significant share of independents who, prior to sort of, I would say, his rise in prominence in that position, really had no opinion about him at all. He only beat Mike Collier, his challenger, in 2018 by a little less than 5 points. And I think you can tell from Patrick's actions that he sees this as a more competitive race than he's probably faced in the past, because he's already begun attacking Collier directly by name, which is something that candidates, usually avoid doing because they don't want to raise the name recognition of their opponent unless they think that their opponent might pose some kind of a challenge. So I think Patrick's own actions show us that this race is a more competitive one than maybe some other people might suspect.
And what do you make of Mike Collier? He really is focusing on what he calls, quote, fix the damn grid. It appears almost as if he's almost a one-issue candidate. How risky is that?
It's very risky, but I think the issue here is the grid is not necessarily about the grid. It's about a return to seriousness. I think what Collier is trying to do in his own way is manifest this referendum election idea, which is to say, look, the focus has been on a lot of issues that really aren't necessarily top of mind issues for most voters. And so the grid is one of those things which is representative of the basic function of state government. We can't point to anybody else and blame them for our grid because it's Texas's grid. And so I think that's really, what Collier is trying to do with that is he's trying to hang on a simple message that, resonates with voters because it sort of points to, basically the failure of the state to maintain some basic services.
If we are able to get through this intensely awful summer as far as temperatures are concerned, without having any issues to the grid, does that just kind of fall apart on him?
I think that's the main problem with the grid as an issue in and of itself, is that people will need to be reminded, and to the Democrats' advantage, people have been reminded repeatedly this summer as they've been asked to conserve energy. But having said that, once we get out of the sweltering summer months, and if the grid can handle what would be a normal winter in Texas, the issue will lose resonance. But again, I would suspect that at that point you'll see whether Collier or O'Rourke pivot to again this more general question about stewardship of state government.
And let me ask you about the Attorney General's race. Where do you see this right now between Ken Paxton and Rochelle Garza?
Well, Ken Paxton carries the most political baggage of any candidate at the top of the ticket due to a number of legal problems he's had over the since before he assumed office. So this is a race that Paxton could lose as much as Rochelle Garza could win in many ways. I mean, she certainly can take some of the issues that he's really been out on the forefront directly to him around the issue of both abortion and, I would say, immigration and border security. But at the same time, I think one of the Rochelle Garza has a few advantages in her pocket. Number one, I think representing a very diverse party and being really the only woman and non-white candidate at the top of the ticket is meaningful, especially for Democratic voters. But I also think, she benefits from the fact that Ken Paxton went through a bruising Republican primary. And if she wants to remind voters about Ken Paxton's legal and ethical problems, she can simply go back to that primary campaign and find Republicans saying these things about Ken Paxton. And that's much more powerful, I think, than anything else, really in that race.
But with border security still being a top of mind issue here in Texas, isn't it still Paxton's race to lose, given all of his legal challenges against the Biden administration?
All of these races are the Republican candidates to lose. Ultimately, Texas is a competitive state at this point. We can't say that this is an out and out red state, but it's certainly not a swing state, and it's hardly purple. Ultimately, Democrats are going to have to, demonstrate an ability to win at the top of the ticket before we can say that Texas is a competitive state. And ultimately, until that happens, these are all races for Republicans to lose.
And my last question to you is just about this notion of Latinos moving more over to the Republican Party, many of them being independents. We certainly saw Flores win in South Texas temporarily in the special election, but there's going to be a lot of focus. That may be one of the most closely watched congressional races in Texas for sure, but maybe even nationally as well, to see what happens. What do you make of this? Is this being overblown, or is this a real thing?
I think we have to be really careful in interpreting the Hispanic vote too broadly. Ultimately, what's going on in South Texas, to my mind, and based on the analyses that I'm doing, is representative of Republicans reaching out to, Hispanic, but largely rural voters who, for the most part, they haven't competed for in previous election cycles because they haven't had to. As the states become more competitive, ultimately what you're finding is Republicans seeking out and turning out Hispanic voters in rural areas that still tend to be overwhelmingly Democratic when the votes are all counted. But the reality is that most Hispanics in Texas, like most people in Texas, live in and around the state's urban and suburban areas. And these are the areas where Democrats are making overwhelming gains election cycle after election cycle. So ultimately, I think there's a little bit of truth in this movement among Hispanics. For sure, it's in the data, and there's no doubt about it. But ultimately, I think what you have to do is you have to consider this more about, or at least as much about location and sort of the accompanying socioeconomic status and ideologies that go along with that, as you do just about race. And to think about it solely as, well, Republicans are doing well in South Texas, so therefore they're doing well with Hispanics, is just not really a viable argument when you realize the fact that, the vote gains the Democrats have been making in the suburban counties, again, where most Hispanics, like most people in Texas, live, far outpaces any gains that Republicans are making in these other counties.
All right, we will have to leave it there. Josh Blank with the Texas Politics Project at UT Austin. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate all of your insight very much.
Thanks for having me.